All right. I think I'm recording. Am I recording? I am recording. Okay. So, I am doing another video because we got another weather event. I thought I was gonna be able to make it into class, and the ice is like a sheet. Like my car just slid sideways. Uh, so I turned around and came home. Um, so anyway, what we're doing today this week is exactly the same as the other weeks. I'm going to give you a lecture here. I do have a pretty bad cold right now, so I might have to edit this and cut out some coughing and sneezing here in the middle. But I'll walk you through all the main pieces of the material this week, and then you finish up with taking your notes, reading the book, and submit that for points. And that's pretty much the gist for this week. Now, next week, maybe by the end of the week, I'm gonna give you there's 4 kind of unit assignments within the class. And so we're getting close to me assigning the first unit assignment. You'll have a couple weeks to work on it. So I just wanted to give you a quick heads up about that to watch for information about your first unit assignment. Okay, so anyway, we're in chapter 3. We're just pretty much doing 1 chapter a week. This is, I believe, the easiest chapter, but you can disagree with me. I think this is the easiest chapter we have so far. In fact, I think it's one of the easiest chapters in the whole book. And the material that is in this chapter, we covered almost all of it in 260, at least a little bit. So hopefully there's nothing in here that is too surprising to you. I'm going to blow this up a little bit. We're going to start with our first concept. And the first concept, the whole chapter is about athletes. And so we last chapter was talking about the sports or the movements, and there's these specific requirements and specific issues that arise with specific movements or joints or basically the sport or the joint or the movement. Now we're talking about the athletes, and so we're looking at how athletes are going to be different from each other, and we're going to be focusing on both differences that are genetic and unchanging or pretty set, and then those that are more trainable. So as we go along, start to think about is this trainable, or is this something that the athlete comes with, and it's pretty much set. Like the only way to get a different variable would be get a different athlete. So the first concept that we cover here is sarcomeres in parallel or in series. So remember that a sarcomere is the smallest unit of force production in a muscle cell. And it's from Z line to Z line, and you've got the actin reaching in, and you got the myosins in the middle, and we got the sliding filament theory, and that's your sarcomere. So we got all these sarcomeres lined up end to end end to make a myofibril. And we have tons, like dozens of myofibrils inside of one myofiber, one muscle cell. And so we will put those myofibrils, line them up long ways, and then wrap the cell membrane around that, and that makes one muscle cell. And then we have muscle cell. We're going to have to stack the muscle cells all together to make the actual visible muscle. But this concept is pretty simple. And so what I'm going to do is, let me get my pen. And basically, you can see in this diagram, which is from the book, and we first over here start with it with the series. So A is series. This is in series. And basically what we have is 2 sarcomeres stacked on top of each other. And if we are going to cause, in fact, I honestly, these drawings are a little weird to me. I think the best way to think about this is like rubber bands or something. And if you think about, I have a rubber band, right? Here's a loop of a rubber band. And then I'll tie it to a next rubber band or link in the chain. And I tie it to the next rubber band or link in the chain. And I tie that to the next rubber band or link in the chain. So what you see here is that I have 4 of them, and they've been chained together end to end. This is what we mean by series. In series means that if these are rubber bands and I tied them one to the other, I would have made a long string end to end, and this rubber band would be able to stretch further than any of single rubber band. But it won't be stronger than any single rubber band. Think about this, because the weakest part of a rubber band, one rubber band, that's still, if this is just, whoops, where's my annotation? This is still just one rubber band wide. So if one rubber band has a weakness in it, the whole strand will be weak. Now, in parallel would take four rubber bands, four same rubber bands, but instead of putting them end to end, I'm going to make them, oh, that's a big old fat one. I'm going to make them side by side. And so in this case, I attach all the rubber bands to maybe a ring over here, and then I attach them to something over here. So this ring is not a rubber band. This is what I'm going to pull on. And if I try to pull those two rings apart with four rubber bands between them, it's 4 times stronger than if I had just one rubber band. So in parallel, the sarcomeres are going to be much more higher force producing, whereas in series, we might have increased range of motion. We might have a really good speed of motion, because when these contract, they'll pull real fast inwards. But we won't have much more strength. It won't be stronger than if we had put them in parallel. And of course, this matches up. If you remember, we had this discussion in 260, but to remind you that when we have muscle shapes that are long and thin, like let's say a sartorius, so you got that leg, and you're going to have that sartorius wrap from up around the hip, and then across the thigh, and then down below the knee. Here's your knee. That sartorius is a long, thin muscle, and it's going to have lots of sarcomeres in series because it's got this long structure. Whereas if you take a look at something like the gastrocnemius, the gastrocnemius is such an interesting muscle shape because its tendon is shaped like this at the back of the knee. Tendon is shaped like this. And then we have hold on. Oh, sorry. Okay. I was finished. All right, let's try this again. So we have at the back of the knee, you have your right gastrocnemius or your medial gastrocnemius and your lateral gastrocnemius on each side. That's the tendon. And the tendon is this weird shape because the muscle runs in this shape like this. And each of these would be, fibers, muscle fibers, and strings of muscle fibers and fascicles, essentially. And so you can see that I'm drawing them mostly parallel, and I'm creating a very strong, lots and lots of fascicles. And that's one side, and then on the other side, we just repeat that process. And I am very slow because I'm using my mouse, and it's not a very effective way to draw, but you get the idea. And then these all connect down here to the Achilles tendon, which runs down to, of course, the Achilles. And so, but you can see here that this is in parallel, because if one of these breaks, if one of these is weak and breaks, well, no big deal. We've got so many others. I got this one, this one, this one, this one, this one. They're all working together. They're all working together, as opposed to that in a series. So what this table does is it lays out, get out of here. This table lays out, can I go down? There we go. The table lays out some different characteristics and how they compare between series and parallel. But you can see here two graphs at the bottom. And so basically, one is a forced time curve, and a forced time curve would show us things like rate of force development, that good old RFD from last week. So if you want to look at which one develops force faster and which one develops higher force, well, we know the one with higher force is going to be the one in parallel. But here's our in series. On the other hand, here's a force velocity curve. Force, this is different. Note the difference. Velocity is on the x-axis this time, okay? So flip your head around. That one in series is going to produce faster overall movements possible, but of course we just already said lower overall force. So this is a good kind of overview of the series and parallel question. Now we come back to that question of, well, is this set for athletes or is this trainable? And the answer is not clear. So some muscles probably are more trainable than others. Certainly we have genetic factors that make it easier for us to gain muscle mass. And when we gain hypertrophy, there will always be some increase in the parallel structure. So more parallel fascicles, more parallel myofibrils, more parallel myofibers. So the answer on this one is yes and no. There's going to be genetic factors that play into this. There's going to be natural build that people come with, but it's not entirely set. We can definitely cause everybody hypertrophy to some small extent, at least. And then some people will be hyper responders and they'll have some really large amounts of hypertrophy. And so anyway, the next picture I'm going to show you is the one that's showing up here right now. So this is a NFL football player, and we're going to just compare that physique to a ballet dancer. Over here is, let me get rid of my markings. Over here is a ballerino, elite ballerino, and you can see that they have different kind of amounts of hypertrophy, different kind of muscle structures, one being more bulky, one being still very muscular, very lean, of course, but don't focus on the leanness or like how cut they are. Focus on the muscle masses. And so the NFL player is going to have more mass, and naturally, because of the greater mass, more parallel. And if you think about the training and the sport play, range of motion, we need a normal range of motion for sure for the NFL player. But the ballerino is going to need to have muscles that have much larger ranges of motion, and they're going to have to be strong at the ends of the range of motion in ways that an NFL player, is not going to find themselves, in a splits needing to exert force. Like, that shouldn't happen. That shouldn't happen on the field. So this athlete would benefit and does achieve as they go through their training. The ballerino is going to have more development of sarcomeres in series than the NFL player would. And that would be a natural extension of their sports demands and the types of training. Just think about how much time a ballerina is going to spend stretching versus an NFL player spends stretching. And even if the time were the same, the levels of stretch are nothing the same, right? This NFL player is never going to start his warm up with the splits. And that is exactly where we would start with the ballerinos. So another example of this is the two forms of gymnastics. So looking at women's gymnastics, we have the standard form of gymnastics, which most people are very closely aware of, which here's Simone Biles. And I just got two pictures of athletes in the same position, so you can kind of compare them. And Simone Biles, very flexible. But traditional gymnastics, especially, it's getting more and more this way, is very, very power-based. In vaulting, Simone's best event, she is going to run full speed, sprint full speed into the vault, and then push off of it, fly through the air, doing twists and turns, and then land. And so high forces, high power, high speed, high rate of force development. And so she gets going to have naturally, by even just training that, even if typically gymnasts don't do much, if any, resistance training as part of their training. It wouldn't surprise me if Simone Biles did do some, because of she she's a little older, she's a little wiser, and she's kind of coming from a non-traditional form of training. As the standard form of training is in the gymnasium only. It wouldn't surprise me if she had more exposure to a strength coach or something like that. It wouldn't surprise me if she didn't, though, either. She is not necessarily muscularly developed because of strength conditioning, because you do the things she does, you will develop muscles. Now, let's compare that musculature of her legs over here to the other form of gymnastics, rhythmic gymnastics, which there is almost no tumbling at all. The tumbling in that is just not part of that sport. It is much more about grace and smoothness, and they manipulate objects. I think if you had me for XFIS or other classes, I might have shown you this before, because they're a great example of a sport where it is like ballerinos and ballerinas. It's very much like long, lean lines. It's graded aesthetically, and so it matters more that your leg comes to a nice point than how far you can run or jump, or how powerful you are in a tumbling pass. And so you can see that the muscular development in comparison to Simone Biles is much, much less, and that her flexibility is much more, even though if it's not necessarily shown it is actually in this kind of curve in your back would be pretty extreme for a gymnast. Not impossible maybe, but not the norm. This is the norm for rhythmic gymnastics. Typically, rhythmic gymnasts go way past a straight splits, and they do splits that are more like U-shaped. As you can see here, her splits is way past like straight. Okay, anyway, so there's examples of kind of an athlete who's going to need to, from beginning of training to where they become to elite, they need series, hypertrophy in series, where a sport that's going to need a little more hypertrophy in parallel. Okay, there's a question here for you. I am going to leave that for later. You can work on that. I went through, kind of talked about it. It's in the book. But the next topic we'll be covering then is the forms of hypertrophy. So the book first starts out with talking about, well, what is hyperplasia? Hyperplasia is the creation of new muscle cells. So we're increasing the muscle size by increasing the number of cells. And then, of course, hypertrophy is taking existing cells and making them larger, right? And so there are two types of hypertrophy that are important for us to understand. And the first one in this list right here is myofibrillar hypertrophy. So myo, of course, means muscle, and fibrillar is referring to the myofibrils, the strings of sarcomeres that are within muscle cells. And so within a muscle cell, let's take this guy. This muscle is going to have 1, 2, 3 by 4. So here are 12 myofibrils. Now it's way more than 12, like way more than 12, but follow me. This is a demonstration. So this has clearly hypertrophied from a starting place, which is 6. So in this case, The starting place would have been 6. And so this is doubled. This is doubled from its starting place. And in myofibrillar hypertrophy, the cell gets larger because we put more contractile proteins, myofibrils, into the cell. More force production units got bigger, got stronger. So in this form of hypertrophy, we are going to see significant increases in muscle strength. And we can test this on a one cell level, and yep, that cell is stronger. We can test this on a whole muscle level. And what we'll see under a microscope is when we started out, we had small little cells. Now we have big cells. And when we test them with a 1 rep max, they're definitely stronger. That's what we typically think of as hypertrophy. But it's not the only form of hypertrophy. The other option is over here in the green. I told you that both of the cells, blue and green, started with 6, by this little diagram, 6 myofibrils. And this cell used to be this size with 6 myofibrils, but now it is bigger and it still only has 6 myofibrils. This cell has gotten bigger, but it filled the cell with things other than contractile proteins. What could cause a cell to grow in size if not contractile proteins, if not sarcomeres, if not myofibrils? All the other stuff in a cell. So here's not the main thing, but we talk about creatine. Creatine is known to cause people to gain weight. That's a known thing. And it does this by putting more creatine into the muscle cells. And when you put more creatine into the muscle cells, it also takes water with it. And so cells go from this to swelling up. And so creatine causes sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. Each muscle cell gets a little larger, but it's not increased proteins, contractile proteins, not at least at first. It's increased water and creatine, phosphocreatine. So this, the cytoplasm or the sarcoplasm, that's the technical name for cytoplasm in a muscle cell is sarcoplasm. The sarcoplasm got bigger, not the contractile proteins. Now that was one example, not the most common example. Another form of training or activity that will cause sarcoplasmic hypertrophy is if someone gets hypertrophy by doing really high volume, but lower weight activities. So if somebody's doing sets of 50, you think some not all CrossFit workouts are kind of along this crazy line, like, do 150 of something and then that's your workout for the day. So that could be a trigger for sarcoplasmic hypertrophy because if we're going to do really long sets of activity, but the weight is very low, well, I need to adjust, I need to adapt, I need to, general adaptation, but I don't need more contractile proteins because what you're asking me to do was light. You just asked me to do it so many stupid times that I got tired. And so sarcoplasmic hypertrophy happens a lot of times when we add the more mitochondria, more Krebs cycle enzymes, more glycolysis enzymes, so all of the enzymes and things like that that are necessary for maintaining a really long duration of work. We can also see sarcoplasmic hypertrophy occur in endurance athletes who are training almost exclusively with their endurance sport. Their muscles can hypertrophy, but they don't really always hypertrophy with contractile proteins. Sometimes they're just hypertrophying with all of the mechanical machinery necessary to fuel that exercise. Now, there's let me go on here. So the middle one is another form of adaptation that can occur. And this is where instead of giving the body a stimulus to grow, either in myofibrils, getting stronger, each cell getting stronger, nor getting, able to do muscular endurance better. Sometimes we can see just the cells stay the same size, but and that's what the lightning bolts are identifying, but they get neuromuscularly more efficient. And this is kind of the holy grail for athletes who are in weight class sports where they're already at the top of their weight class and they want to get stronger or faster or more powerful, but they don't want to leave their weight class. And so we could see adaptations that basically improve the quality of contraction, the neuromuscular controls of contraction, without seeing any hypertrophy. Athletes can get stronger without hypertrophy. That's known. We know that. And again, so some athletes, that's our real goal, is increased strength, but no change in mass. No change in mass. And that would be this one. And so this produces some different body types. So the classic example of sarcoplasmic hypertrophy is bodybuilders. You see, they aren't tested in how strong they are. That doesn't matter one bit. How strong you are in a bodybuilding competition counts for nothing. So we don't care if your muscles are just full of other stuff. And in fact, it's kind of better. It's kind of better because if this muscle will only get so big, but we have all sorts of tricks to like make the muscle expand just a little more. And so the classic bodybuilder build is not actually pound for pound very strong. Pound for pound. I mean, they're still strong. They're still very strong. But if you took somebody who weighed exactly the same, if you took this guy who weighed exactly the same as this guy would beat him every time in strength tests, because this guy would have, this is a power lifter. This guy would have focused entirely on building the strength, the hypertrophy for strength, the myofibrillar hypertrophy. That kind of makes sense? And then most athletes are, in fact, somewhere in the middle. And this is because a lot of sports, not all sports, powerlifting is an example of a very anaerobic, fast, do your lift and rest for 5 minutes kind of activity. But many sports do have an endurance, a strength and endurance component to it. CrossFit is a great example of this. So the typical CrossFit athlete is going to be either causing hypertrophy that is a mixture of the two. So they have a little bit of sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, and they're also getting a little more myofibrils so that they can work harder, longer. Think about a CrossFit workout. That's exactly what they're demanding, is high weights, high reps. And so they have to have a little bit of both. But a lot of sports and a lot of kind of natural builds are a little bit of both. Now, one thing I would say is an example of this neuromuscular efficiency model is to go back to our gymnastic athletes. They're not trying to get as big and buff as possible like a bodybuilder, because looks don't matter. In fact, they don't really want to get as big as possible because every pound of weight they gain will make an activity like this more challenging. This would also go for something like a rock climber. They want to be stronger, but they do not want to gain much weight to do it. And so they're really interested in making the weights, the mass that they have, more efficient. And I always think about this middle one, this neuromuscular efficiency model. I always think of this as like the sinewy people. They're big, but they're not super big. But you just don't want to mess with them. They're just like tough. And I always think about Leonidas in the 300. In 300, I think of him as being like a great example of someone who's just really sinewy. He's got a good amount of mass for sure, but his goal was clearly not mass. And he's probably not the strongest of any type of athlete because he's a soldier. And what he wanted was to have that balance of, enough size to be dangerous. And from there, it's all about that efficiency aspect. So I think of these as sinewy people. And there are certain sports that is definitely the kind of the ideal. Um, the um, the things that come to mind though a lot is military. There are certainly people in the military who want to be big and heavy, but especially sometimes in the special forces and stuff, sometimes they'll even have teams that are more aerobic focused, more like they got to be big and tough, but they also need to just be tough for a long time. And there's mental aspects, but I'm talking about the physical aspects. And so in the military, because the aerobic or like sustaining a workload can be, depending on the situation, the goal, then you can get some athletes who are really sinewy, who are they don't have tons of mass, they have enough, but the mass they have, they just know how to use it really well. And that's kind of our takeaway there. Okay, so I've given you some keys into like the differences here. Now let's talk a little bit about the differences in programming that produce these different ones. So, we're looking at our sarcoplasmic hypertrophy of a bodybuilder. Well, what builds the sarcoplasmic hypertrophy? Low weights, crazy high reps. And there's a few techniques that really just land on this one. And so has you'd ever done drop sets where like somebody's going to do bicep curls until basically they cannot lift their arms. So they lift, the 50-pound dumbbells, they do bicep curls and they go down to the 40s and they go down to the 30s and they're just doing bicep curls until they cannot lift that weight anymore. They're not really taking rest in between. And they just keep going until the bicep is so fatigued, they're on fives and they're barely able to get a rep out with five. And they don't even count the reps because that's not the point. The whole point was to cause basically the muscle cells to scream, we don't have enough energy to continue. It's not the force that's causing this to be so difficult. It's that we're running out of ATP. Build more of everything that gives us energy. Build more of the sarcoplasmic proteins. And so that's a definite training method that's used here. Things like supplements that would fall into this category. And we know that this is going to be a not only supplements, but also steroid abuse kind of thing. The bodybuilders are going to be using creatine. They're going to be using glycerol, which is a supplement which causes water to be increased storage into the cell. They don't care if it's not functional mass. They don't care. It just needs to be big and look good when they flex on stage. And so, again, really high reps and low rest ranges or short rests. And just like that's why bodybuilders will do split days so that they can like really challenge a muscle and just use up its energy and then keep challenging the muscle to convince it to build more mitochondria, more sarcoplasmic proteins. But again, it's not making them stronger. It's not making them stronger. It's just making their muscles bigger. And then we've got over here on the other extreme, if you're going to take a power lifter, weightlifters would fit into this category. Anybody who's actually training for strength and size, but mostly strength, is going to be on this end, where when they're training for hypertrophy, it is moderate intensity, moderate volumes, and they're going to do mostly whole body days because they're going to want to get the testosterone response that will cause them to build the myofibrillar proteins. And so that's where we talked about in 260, we want to get the athletes to work as much muscle mass on their body as possible. So, and then give them rest, true rest, to let them build the myofibrillar proteins, and then another hard day of training, and then another day of rest. Now, it doesn't always have to be done that way, but that's kind of that would be the better way to trigger the myofibrillar hypertrophy. And then, of course, you got those athletes in the middle who do a little of both, They'll do some activities that are lower weight, but much more higher duration. And then they'll do some activities that are going to be, more in line with the hypertrophy strength model. How would you train athletes to not gain mass while they're gaining strength? Well, that can be a challenging one, and the main thing is that, you're going to just mimic whatever it is they're doing in their sport. Um, you're going to or in this case, military training in ancient Greece. Um, and another piece of this one is that oftentimes, and I think of wrestlers as well, I need to increase my strength without increasing my mass, will limit any additional calories in. So I don't want you to gain muscle mass, therefore we're going to keep your calories where you are, but train harder. And so that's how you can kind of prevent increases in muscle mass, but still increase strength. It's typically, very dedicated athletes in very specific sports where that's the case. Okay. Obviously that can be a tricky thing to find that balance. But anyway, so now it's just asked you kind of go through and the different types of training. So the next concept is body weight and body size. Now, of course, athletes come to you with different body weights and body sizes, and it is changeable, but things like height is not changeable. And so you can definitely have small athletes who will always be small athletes, and you can have large athletes who will always be large athletes, and you can have athletes in the middle. And so there is a piece of this that's unchangeable. And then, of course, we can train to build hypertrophy as well. But the first concept here we have is basically to express um, the weight, the strength of an individual based upon their body weight. And so the first axis over here, the absolute strength, is the open triangles. And so basically, smaller athletes, here's a 56-kilogram athlete, lifts this much. And over here's a 77-kilogram athlete, they lift this much. These, by the way, are the weight classes for men's weightlifting. That's what these numbers are, 105. The 147 is the actual weight of the super heavyweight category, so an actual athlete's weight. But you can see that each weight category lifts more than the last weight category. However, on this axis over here, we have relative strength, or the amount of strength, the amount of weight lifted divided by the body weight of the athlete. And that's the black ones here. And what you can see is that pound for pound, the smaller athletes lift more relative weight. They lift a greater percentage of their body weight, would be another way to think about this. And so we see this pattern really across all of our strength and strength endurance activities. Again, we can have this kind of maybe not helpful, but I always think of it as our sinewy athletes are athletes who have as much mass as they can fit on, given that they're not going to move up a weight class. They're out here, they're very efficient with the muscle mass that they have. And then we have our heavyweight and super heavyweight athletes who are putting on as much mass as they can to get a little bit stronger. And so you get this dichotomy of actual loads lifted versus relative loads lifted. Here's another one to look at this. This is another way to look at weightlifting categories. And this is snatch by body weight percentage for men and snatch as a percentage of body weight for women in red. And you can see that there's a difference between men and women, which shouldn't surprise you. But you can also see that the percentages of body weight lifted for snatch go down as body weight goes up. And so as a percentage, the smaller lifters lift more. This is another one. This is world records by body weight. And again, you can just see here, as body weight increases, we see increases in world record. However, notice that it's not linear, that it starts to level off. And so after you get to about 100 kilos or so, the impact of gaining any amount of weight is reduced. If a 60-kilogram person gained 5 kilos of body weight of muscle mass, they would have a big jump in their performance total. But when you get up to here to 120 and they gain 5 pounds of muscle mass, they only see a very small jump in their actual performance. So that can play a role in different sports as well. So if you look at football, for example, there are definitely positions on the football team where extra mass is helpful, but the benefits of that extra mass will reduce the heavier they get. And so there's going to be a kind of number where they're going to have as much strength as they need, but also as much power as they need and as much force to body weight ratio as they need. You can't just assume that keeping going up is going to be better, not better. Also, not possible that you could increase your hypertrophy infinitely without, pharmaceutical intervention called cheating. Okay, this is a graph of powerlifting, and basically what you see here is the lines for bench, squat, and deadlift. So each line is bench, squat, and deadlift. And then the blue line is when you add together their total lift. And so you can see here as well that the with each increase in weight class in powerlifting, there is an increase in strength, but it's not that dramatic. Like it's pretty subtle between each class. There's just small increases in the different performance variables. Now, that's again kind of the characteristic of powerlifting. Each movement's going to kind of have their own pattern, but yeah, the largest people are the strongest, but per body weight they're not the strongest. The book has a table here which shows you how to basically using the conversions, which you can use Sinclair formula, there's a Wells formula, there's a couple of others, but basically what the author Zatsiorsky has done is created for you at a given body weight in kilograms what equivalent strength would be for an athlete in another weight class. And so you can kind of compare. So an athlete who is 60 kilograms is going to be compared to these athletes in this way. So I don't know if it's helpful to you. That's great. It was something I just thought I'd throw in there. The relations between the strength of the athlete and the body weight. So, okay. The last graph in here is probably the most useful, but also probably the most confusing. And this is basically, what is the relationship? What is the relationship? What is the best way to describe this curvilinear relationship between strength and body weight? And turns out, if you make it on a logarithmic scale, the log of a person's weight or weight class is tightly correlated. You can see how tightly correlated, linearly tightly correlated to the log of performance weight lifted. And so basically it's a logarithmic relationship. It's a log-log relationship. Does that have any meaning to us in terms of training our athletes? No, not really. Just thought I'd show you. But that is the best, most clearest way to look at this relationship. And the second best is to look at it in a graph like this, where we see it's a curvilinear relationship that we have decreases as we get weights higher, the body weights higher and higher. All right, let's move on to the next section, which is looking at, again, the concept of what's not necessarily how much mass you have, it's how you use what you have. And the book goes in and gives some very interesting examples of this. And I think they're fantastic examples of how two athletes could be great at the same sport, but be great from different biological starting places. And so this table 3-2 compares two world-class gymnasts who both won world championships, who are both Olympians, these are two amazing, historically important gymnasts. And we're going to look at how in one particular event in gymnastics, One of them was much more hypertrophied, had more muscle mass and stronger, but another one was just using every bit of his strength, um, 100%. So he was in that sinewy, like I'm not super strong, but I can use every ounce of my strength effectively. So Azarian was the first gymnast, and he is historically like the guy who did the iron crosses. Okay, he is the best Olympic gymnast when it comes to iron cross. He has several moves named after him, including a version of an iron cross. And so I'm going to show you this quick video. Oops, I didn't need to click on that. Well, okay, I'll show you this quick video. Okay, so I'm gonna pause it here. So what the story is this was he invented this exercise, this movement, when he was at the USSR championships back when it was the Soviet bloc countries, and Armenia was part of Russia. And what happened was the Russian judges were probably being unfair to all the other athletes, showing some sort of favoritism. And so he was the last to go on the rings, and all of the Armenians were getting like way low scores. And the judges said, "Oh, they're not holding their strength moves long enough. You have to do a certain number of strength moves on the rings." And so he went last, and then I'll let him finish. Okay, so I'm actually gonna, I can't forward. Hold on. I'm gonna make him silent. I wanted to just get a picture of him in the cross. Boom, that's perfect. Okay, so Azarian had, he's a gymnast. He had great upper body muscularity. But what he did, the Azarian cross, when he held the iron cross for 4 seconds, the requirement is 3. He held it for 4 seconds, then twisted and asked, "Is this long enough?" Then twisted and asked, "Is this long enough?" What he did was extended the required time way past the 3 that was required, which obviously he was doing purposefully. And so in order to do a strength move like that, Azarian was again recognized as a master on this implement. He was the best on this implement, and he had amazing upper body strength. Now, one of the authors of this textbook, the Zasyorsky, is from one of the Russian bloc country. I don't know if it's Russia exactly or if it was like Bulgaria or something. But he basically his career started in the Soviet system of training. And so you'll notice that he uses a lot of Soviet athletes in his examples, and he uses a lot of Soviet like athlete data in his examples. And it's because he's got the data, because he was there, like he was coached by trained by the coaches who worked with these athletes. And so it's because he has the ins with those athletes. It's kind of cool. Great author, great sports scientist, like hands down, read his stuff. But anyway, so Azarian, he has actual test numbers for Azarian. So this is arm adduction. So they probably were using either a cable stack or something, and they were, putting his arm out and pulling it down, or they might have been using an isometric strength tester to do this. But they tested how much adduction can you do with an arm, and just so this is one arm, and the um, the the weight that he was able to do was 89, His body weight was 74 kilos, so if I'm pushing down with 89 pounds, 89 kilos of force, but my body weight is 74, that means I have strength above what is necessary to hold this isometrically. Think about your force velocity curve. And that basically, if we look at it from force to body weight, he had a force to body weight ratio of 1.2. And he would, knowing that this was his strength, this was his event, this is the thing he does better than anyone else, inside of his little routine for the rings, he would always add multiple iron crosses. Like that one event was kind of cool, but he would do this all the time. He was the master of iron crosses. He would just show them off. And so he would do 5 or 6 of these in a composition because he could. And then you take here's the Boris, I think it's Schokland. And if I actually pulled this up earlier, let me go over here. He was another gymnast. He was Russian, not Armenian. And you can watch some of his movements. So Jacqueline's events were pommel horse. He was known for his pommel horse, and he was known for his high bar routine. Those were, I mean, he was a good all-around gymnast, but those were his events. Rings was not his best event. He's very famous for his high bar. And he's got the parallel bars coming up. You can see some more of his amazing work here. That's enough. Okay, so Jacqueline, another amazing gymnast. Not so great on the rings. Go back to my not so great on the rings, and here's why he was not so great on the rings as compared to Azarian. So his arm adduction force was 69.2 kilograms, but his body weight was 70 kilograms. So essentially, he had just enough, or just not quite enough, just enough strength to hold iron cross. He was able to do it isometrically, but he couldn't move around on the iron cross the way Azarian could because he didn't have the force velocity curve. He didn't have the capabilities to do that. And so, of course, if you're not good at something, you wouldn't put a bunch of it into your program because then you would fail and then you would get low scores. And so Jacqueline would do the minimum one iron cross or related strength move per his routine, or maybe two. But he couldn't even come close to the way Azarian was doing all these strength moves in his. So if we have these two different athletes, the same sport, the exact same sport, with two different athletes, and they're both going to be successful. But the sport itself basically made it possible for them to be successful in that they were able to specialize in the events, and so really earn tons of points in one event, and then have an event that wasn't as great. I mean, still freaking fantastic, but elite level. but not as great. And this happens a lot in different sports. And so an athlete who plays basketball who isn't as tall, they're faster. You know what I mean? If they're going to be successful, they're going to be faster. An athlete in wrestling who's a little too tall for their weight class, right? A little too scrawny. Maybe they make up for it by just focusing on skill 100% more, depending on what level you're at. You might have a soccer player who has an atypical build, but they'll figure out like, okay, but I'm good at this. I'll get around it with this. And so we actually see that a lot. And so when you are thinking like, oh, this athlete has the right build for this sport, or this athlete doesn't have the right build for this sport, be careful not to get too rigid in your thinking, because people can bring to the table things you did not realize that they had. And I think personally, one of the examples I have of this is, typically 100-meter sprinters are pretty muscular, very muscular. The greatest 100-meter sprinters are they're just a little bulkier than some of our other athletes on the track team, like not the throwers or anything, but like they're very, very muscular in comparison to the high jumpers, in comparison to some of the others. But on my track team in college, we had a sprinter, and man, she just didn't gain muscle mass like that, but she was fast. She was absolutely fast. And so something about her muscle structure was more like muscles in series, but she was able to use the strength that she had, which was less than everybody, like a lot less than everybody else, in her 100-meter sprint group. But she could just use that strength way better than they could use their strength. So she absolutely competed with them. In fact, was the number 2 sprinter on the team. So don't get over focused on ideal body types, because sometimes athletes bring things to the table, or methods of doing something that can make them successful anyway. All right, so here's another one. This is an example of another athlete he has data for, and this time he's following the same athlete, both like early in training and late in training. I'm pretty sure I told 260 last year, you guys, all about the Soviet training method. And the Soviet training method is to start kids quite young, but then to specialize them in their sport, basically not based on what they want, but based on what they will be good at. And so she's a product of the Soviet training system. This is, I think it's Vera Krupkina, and she was a sprinter, long jumper, and she might have even done heptathlon. I don't even know if they had heptathlon back then for women. They might not have even had heptathlon for them, but she was basically all-around power on track and field. And so you have data from her when she is 16, and again when she's 24 at the peak of her career. And you can see that from age 16 to 24, she lost 10 kilos. Her height remained exactly the same. Her weight to height ratio obviously went down. And we see that she had a far higher standing long jump. Her long jump went further, and her sprint time was way faster. And so you can see kind of a pattern of this change over time. And one of the things that would have happened from 16 to 24 is that she would have been maybe on track to like, we knew she was going to be a power athlete, but she wasn't specializing in track and field. And when it became clear that based upon her height, that she was going to need to do these events in track and field, and they're like, okay, well, now it's time to lose the weight. And you can see that her strength, which we don't have a measurement of, her strength probably increased from age 16 to 24, I would have expected. But more importantly, her body weight would have gone up dramatically because her body weight went down. And so her power to body weight ratio is higher. And if her power to body weight ratio is higher, then that standing long jump, and sprint are definitely going to be better. And so this is kind of another perspective on what is changeable, within what is humanly possible, within what is safe for someone to do. I will be honest, this was 1966. Drug use in the Soviet Union didn't get real bad until right around that time. So the late 60s and 70s, the entire 70s and 80s, you should just assume that if they were an athlete from Russia in the Olympics, they were on something illegal today because they couldn't test for it back then. But anyway, this was probably before all of that. So this would have been with mostly or entirely proper training that those things occurred. Anyway, I've got some questions here for you based upon some different sports, and I got a couple links for you to follow if you're interested in learning more about the strength to mass ratio or the power to mass ratio necessary for different sports. Some of these also have to do with like why different athletes, why are short athletes in this sport, why are tall athletes in that sport. So go through those questions. Okay, the next set of images and data that we have is a comparison, a side-by-side comparison of a small athlete and a large athlete. And so the definition here of small and large is that this athlete is 1.5 times the height of this athlete. And you're thinking to yourself, what? How in the world could you have an athlete that's 1.5 times another athlete? Well, that's exactly what happens when you put a gymnast standing next to like a volleyball player. You've got athletes that literally like one is 4'8", maybe, and you've got one that is 6'9", 6'8", 6'10", 6'12", 7 foot. And that's a huge, massive difference. So anyway, this is a theoretical set of athletes. What is shown here is that they are 1.5 times taller, but the body proportions are all identical. That's important. So the humerus length is 1.5 times longer. If you do biceps, it's 1.5 times thicker. The thigh, 1.5 times thicker. Every aspect of this athlete is 1.5 times larger. Okay, so in theory, like just if you look at them, 1.5 times more. But not everything is 1.5 times more, and that's where this table comes in. So the first one, the linear, if we just did the measure, like from here to here, how much of that is 1.5 times the bicep from here to here. And chest, this is from chest across, this is 1.5 times chest across. So linearly, it is a simple 1.5 times relationship. However, when we look at the area, like cross-sectional area of muscle, the amount of muscle mass that's able to produce force, an athlete that is 1.5 times larger gets a 2.25 increase or fold increase in mass, in strength, in cross-sectional area. That would include things like the heart. So like the volumes of no, that might even be down here. But when you start breaking things down inside the body, it's bigger. The difference is larger than the height differences, for example. And so if you look at the volume, so this would be body weight, and I think that the heart fits into this category. Like this athlete's heart is 3 times larger. This athlete's lungs would have 3 times more volume. This athlete's whatever, you see what I'm saying? Like some things are going to be 1.5 times bigger, but strength goes up by 2.25 times. And volume goes up and weight goes up 3.3. But this is why this athlete is less strong per body weight divided by body weight relative to body weight, because body weight goes up threefold, right? Body weight goes up threefold, but strength only goes up 2.25-fold. And so, yeah, they got stronger, a lot stronger. However, they got a lot heavier, more heavier than they got stronger. And so it's a great way to kind of compare and think about this size difference that's happening. The next section of the book talks about the different muscle fiber types. And I just can't even recommend enough that you just go in and read the book. and review all of that. Now, I do think most of it will be a review. They do talk about muscle fiber types that we don't spend as much time talking about. Um, but they don't go into enough detail to make it make sense. What you should know is that different methods of testing produce different fiber types. And if you test humans versus mice or monkeys or anything else, you get different types. Anyway, don't get too confused. Know that our main types here are the ones that we still want to just focus on the most. And so it shows you that one, we can see changes in muscle fiber size, hypertrophy. We can also see hyperplasia. The book talks about what would it look like to see hyperplasia, which we talked about in XPhys, I think, and we also talked about it in 260. And then the third thing it talks about is the transition of one fiber type to another. What does it look like when you start training a type 1 fiber more like a type 2 fiber, and it starts to look like a type 2 fiber? And so it goes and kind of talks about that too, the transitional fiber types, where it's switching fiber types, or it's taking on characteristics of another fiber type. So anyway, take a look at that. I also threw in here for you, I think this is just fascinating. I always am like, well, I wonder what percentage of fibers is average? Like, is 50-50 average? Is 50-50 normal? Is there a difference between men and women? Is there a difference between pre-training to post-training? And so anyway, I found this table for you from a research study. Sorry about that. Okay, I found this study for you from a research study where they did look at training athletes. Actually, I think they were non-athletes, training non-athletes, pre-training to post-training, and they compared men and women, and they looked for differences in fiber types as a percentage of what was showing up in between men and women, between training and untraining. And it's really interesting. So you can see that type 58% of the fiber types, I think this was from the quadricep, which would make a difference. Different muscles have different ratios. But from the quadricep muscle, 58% was type 1 fiber. For men, 22% was type 2A. That's your relatively athletic anaerobic fiber. And then 19% was type 2B. And then after training, you can see that resistance training with the anaerobic component of this sort of training, resistance training, made the type 1 decrease as a percentage. It's not like they disappeared. As a percentage, they reduced. Type 2A definitely increased, massive increase, almost 10% increase, and then a small decrease in type 2B. And so what we see here is that we probably had some fiber type switching, especially between 2B and 2A. That switching is relatively simple for the body to do. The switching from 1 to 2, I don't know. I'm not sure. We could have had hyperplasia, so more 2As formed. And then you could also, this was not just number, but it was size. And so we had larger type 2 fibers. So as a percentage, the type 1 would have reduced that way too. Anyway, you can see that happened here. Now, also just note the gender effects here. There is no statistically significant difference between our pre-training and post-training percentages. There was also no, basically the pattern we saw in the post-training is the same pattern we saw in the women, with just basically a slightly less emphasis on those. Like, it didn't quite go as far as for the men, but it was not statistically significant between the genders. And then, but what was significant, which I thought was interesting that they pulled this out, in the area, the fiber, the fiber volume, like how big the muscle fibers were, there was a significant difference. This probably won't surprise you, in that women started out with lower fiber sizes, less hypertrophied muscle cells. And even though they did experience hypertrophy, it was not, the same rate as we saw in the men. So that's kind of interesting. And then also they looked at ratios, and I'm not sure that that is necessarily as interesting, but anyway, so you can kind of see some real statistical data on this change that's taking place in the muscle fibers. Okay, last concept that I'm going to hit in this chapter is the neurological factors that an athlete brings to the table. And these are playing off the ideas we've already reviewed and covered and looked at in terms of motor unit recruitment. And so if you remember back to XFIZ and to 260, when we talked about motor unit recruitment, we talked about how you recruit small motor units first and then bigger motor units. Let me move down to this diagram here. Here's another diagram to kind of look at how we recruit. And basically, when we do light activities, we recruit essentially all type 1 fiber. And as we start to do higher intensity activities for like running, and then we get up to jumping, we're going to recruit more type 2A fibers and then ultimately type 2B fibers. And so if I drew a line here, the hardest to recruit muscles are these out here. And they're going to be the either 2B, 2X type fibers that we would be recruiting only when we are doing the highest intensity activities. And so basically, the harder the activity is, the more muscle we need to recruit to do it, then we'll just keep recruiting up this pattern like this. Now, over here, this is showing you the speed of that recruitment and the absolute force of the recruitment. So we got a couple of different, got all sorts of different stuff going on here. Let's start with percent of tetanic force developed. So this would be your percent of your maximal force production. So maximal force production is up here. Maximal force production is going to occur when we're doing the highest intensity activities, and that's true. Over here is the absolute force that we're producing. This is, whoops, I lost my thing. So obviously, the higher this goes up, the more can't draw, the more force we're producing. As we go up on this axis, I can't draw on it apparently. And then down here, this is the speed that is just written in here. And this is the speed of that force development. And so you can see that we're going from slower to faster, different forms of recruitment. And then you can see that within running, when you're activating different muscle groups, you get different answers. But anyway, very interesting observations here. And our takeaway from this one is that, well, yeah, we know that we need to recruit the motor units to generate maximal strength. We know recruitment is really important for rate of force development. We know how important this recruitment issue is. Now, let me, it's not really a picture or anything, but I think you should take some notes on this because we're going to come back to it later. That how do we train muscle recruitment? Because you could definitely have some athletes who are naturally more gifted at using the strength that they have, at accessing the strength that they have. But how do you train motor unit recruitment? How would you train that? A couple of different ways. First, one form of increase of recruitment is to do resistance training that is, bring this down, to do resistance training on, not quite yet. Okay, to do resistance training that is many sets at moderate to high loads. And, well, it doesn't even matter the load. Stop and think about this for a minute. Okay, let's start with a light load, but high volume sets and reps. So I'm going to do 30%, but I'm going to do sets of 35, right? And I'm going to do 30 seconds rest before I do it 5 times. So what's going to happen is I'm going to start doing this exercise, and the type 1 fibers will start to fatigue. At least some of them will start to fatigue after, I mean, depending on what it is, repetition number 17, and now 18 is a little harder, now 19 is a little harder, now 20 is a little harder. It feels a little harder because I'm getting fatigue in the fibers that were my original fibers recruited. And so as those initial fibers get tired, okay, so this guy is gotten tired, he's exhausted. This guy and this guy can keep working, and I'm going to have to activate this guy because this guy dropped out. And then I get up to 35, and so after the end of set 1, I'm using these 3 to do the activity as opposed to the original 3. And then I waste 30 seconds and I start again. And by the time I get to 17, 18, 19, okay, now this guy and this guy, they're getting super fatigued. And so I'm going to need to recruit another guy to come in here and help. And so this is what we talked about with those power lifters earlier, how they're doing drop sets and really long sets and really low rest. And they're just really just terrorizing these muscles with high volume, low to moderate weights, but lowish weights. They're eventually going to get to the place where they have exhausted every single muscle fiber, and their brain is reaching out and using a muscle motor unit that they would never have originally recruited. So that is option number 1. And of course, that method would lend itself to not only recruitment, but it will cause hypertrophy in all of the muscle motor units because it went through all of the motor units, causing fatigue. Okay, so that is method number 1. Now, method number 2, how are we going to cause recruitment with a more moderate approach? Well, in a moderate approach, we will, instead of doing a light activity that only requires 3, we're going to do a moderate activity where we require quite a bit of force development, but we're still going to do 5 sets. We'll give you 2 minutes rest in between, or 90 seconds rest in between. But eventually the same thing's going to happen. Like if it's heavier, you'll still get tired. That's the whole point, is that you get tired by the last rep. And so in set 1, I use these muscles because those are the ones that I naturally recruit. But these guys got tired, and now I'm going to need to recruit these guys. So set 2, I use those. And then this one got tired in set 2. So now in set 3, I need to recruit these. And you see, so now doing 5 sets of 10 at a moderate load, I can still do the exact same thing as a drop set did with recruitment, only this time, the stimulus on the cell is not just, oh, we're running out of ATP. Now the stimulus on the cell is, man, this is kind of heavy, and I'm running out of ATP, which is our traditional hypertrophy kind of idea, is moderate weight, moderate weight, high volume. And that would be another way that we can cause hypertrophy. This would be more likely to cause myofibrillar hypertrophy. I'm bringing it back to where we started. Now, another pattern we could use is, I don't really care about the hypertrophy. I just want recruitment. I want that athlete who gets stronger without gaining mass. I want the athletes to be able to use their strength more, but I don't want them building hypertrophy. I want that really, like we said, sinewy, pound for pound, they're just like, the scrappiest little guys. Well, if I'm going to train that athlete, I don't want mass, but I do want to get the mass that they have fully activated. I'm going to use large activities that use fast contractions, and I am going to cause them to do higher intensity work, less reps, no longer high volume. no longer high volume. But I'm gonna make them do activities that are like cleans, where when they get to that second pull, they're activating everything. But we're only gonna do enough to build strength and power. And I will be training my athletes to recruit without training the athlete to hypertrophy sarcoplasmically or hypertrophy myofibrillarly. So that would be a strategy. Plyometrics, same thing. I would choose plyometrics that are high intensity, but I would keep volumes quite low. And I would train their nervous system to get really good at plyometrics, but I wouldn't give them so many that I cause hypertrophy and definitely not injury. I might choose basically all the high power, high velocity, high force modes of training, keep volume low. And that would be a way to cause that efficiency of force production, efficiency of motor unit recruitment without causing hypertrophy, or at least not causing as much hypertrophy. There will always be a little bit, just hopefully it's in line with what you're trying to achieve for that athlete. Okay, I think I am finished for today. My voice is going. Um, anyway, 3 weeks with no meeting, so hopefully next week we'll see each other in person in the classroom. If you have any questions, any problems, my office hours are in the syllabus. And of course, you can just call me or email me or text me whenever you feel like you have questions. I will talk to you soon.